In this session, we're going to be looking at cross-curricular planning and support between departments. So just before we start, I'm sure you've seen me in other webinars, but just for anybody who hasn't, my name is Amanda McLoughlin and I'm a CLIL teacher, teacher trainer and materials writer. And so today we're going to be talking about how we can collaborate with bilingual teachers, how bilingual teachers and English teachers can collaborate, and we'll be looking at a specific example of a project that we could do that's kind of cross-curricular, so that we can see how the different departments and different subjects would work together. So let's have a quick look at what we're planning to do in this webinar before we get started. So the topic of the webinar today is, of course, collaboration. And these are the kinds of questions that I'd like to be able to answer as we go through the webinar today. So what do bilingual teachers do that makes them different from subject teachers, but also different from language teachers? In what kinds of things are going on in the bilingual classroom? And how can we collaborate then? So if we understand what's going on in the bilingual classroom and what's different in the English classroom, how can we look for things that perhaps we can build bridges between the classrooms and look for ways to collaborate between the different types of teachers within one school. And then we'll finish off, as I said before, with an example of a cross-departmental project. And we'll think about the different things that the different teachers from different subject areas and also the language teachers could do to collaborate on the project. Okay, so we'll look at different ways of collaboration. So first of all, we're going to start off, as I said before, thinking about how bilingual teaching is different. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, bilingual teaching is different not just from monolingual teaching of subjects, but it's also different from language teaching. And I think this is something that perhaps people don't necessarily understand fully, but I think is very important. It's not just language teaching, it's actually quite different from language teaching. It's a different kind of approach to language in the classroom, and it's important to understand the differences if we're going to be able to collaborate effectively. We need to understand what's going on in each classroom and how we can make links between those two different kinds of activities. So in bilingual teaching, we have linguistic objectives, of course, because it's in another language. So there is obviously that focus on language, but more importantly, and overarching those linguistic objectives, we have curricular content objectives. So another way of saying this is it's much more important that the learners learn the content and the language is secondary to that. Okay. So language is the vehicle that we use for teaching the concepts, but language is also being taught. But it's not being taught in the same way it's being taught in the language classroom. It's being taught in service to being able to understand the concepts and interact with the concepts of the subject. And there's not necessarily, you're not necessarily following a sequential syllabus of introducing language. The language that's used in the classroom is driven by or is dictated. What do we need to use? It's dictated by how do we talk about the concepts that we're trying to talk about. Okay, so language is subservient to the concept that you're working on. So let's think about what that means then for teachers. That's what bilingual teaching is all about. That's what it means, that we have curricular content goals, that we're aiming for the learners to understand the concepts, and that we're using language as a way of teaching, but also for them to be able to explain their understanding. What does that mean in terms of teachers then? So we've got language teachers. If language teachers want to do CLIL in the language classroom or want to support the bilingual teachers, they need to begin to think about concepts rather than language. So you need to change the focus and the objective of the class and think about how to teach about stuff and not about language, and to teach that effectively. And then subject teachers, when you make the change from teaching in the mother tongue to teaching in the L2, you need to think about language, of course, and how you can help your learners understand input and explain new concepts in that L2. Okay, L2 just means any language which is not the mother tongue in this context. Okay, so we're talking about, it could be English, it could be any other language that you're teaching in, as long as it's not the mother tongue of the learners that you're teaching to. Okay, and this can be quite a challenge, especially for teachers who have not trained specifically in bilingual teaching, or perhaps have a lot of experience of teaching language or a subject, but not bilingual teaching. It can be quite difficult to change the way that we think about things and the way that we approach things. So this is something that we need to kind of overcome. We need to see it from a different perspective, perhaps, in both cases. So let's think about a bilingual lesson then. We've thought a little bit about the objectives and how the teacher has to look at things from a different perspective. Let's think about how a lesson itself might look different from a language lesson. So bilingual lessons are very different from language lessons. In what ways might they be different? So, for example, in a language lesson, the topic or the concepts that the learners are learning about is subordinate to the language. So we look for things that can help us model and demonstrate certain linguistic features that we want our learners to learn. The main aim is the language, even though that they're talking about things and they're reading about different things, or there's a topic or there's a vocabulary set. The main aim is for them to learn language. Okay. However, in a bilingual lesson, the main focus is the concept. So we present concepts in a sequential way in which the concepts that we present become increasingly more difficult and more abstract. And the language is subordinate to that. So we might decide, if we're teaching 6-year-olds, we might be using passive voice with 6-year-olds, that we would never do that in the language classroom. But in a bilingual classroom, they might need to be talking about, who invented the telephone was invented by Alexander Graham Bell, for example. And that's an example of how the topic drives the language. So the language is subordinate to the topic. Okay, the most important thing is that they understand that the telephone was invented by Alexander Graham Bell, and the language that we use in order to explain that is, the language that we're going to be working with in the classroom. Okay. Learners need to understand the teacher's explanations and be able to express the concepts in their own words in the L2. So there is a focus on language, but it's not an explicit focus on language like it might be in the language classroom sometimes. We support linguistic production, we support the understanding of things, but we don't focus on language in the same way. Okay, so it's acquisition of language rather than explicit teaching of language. And it's not sequential, as in we don't avoid language which we consider to be too difficult for them. If the subject topic requires difficult language, then we use that difficult language and we expect the learners to be able to produce it with support. Okay. So once we've understood that those differences, the way that teachers see things from different perspectives, but also the things that teachers are doing, the focus that the teacher has in the activities and tasks that they prepare for their lessons, and the type of language that they're expecting the learners to use and understand in their lessons, then we can start to look for ways in which we can collaborate between subject teachers and language teachers. So language teachers and bilingual teachers don't have to be enemies. They can actually find there's a lot of things that language teachers can do to support bilingual teachers, and there's a lot of things bilingual teachers can do, in fact, to support language acquisition too. So it's a two-way thing, and there's many things that we can do to collaborate, just in general, not just doing projects together, but supporting each other's teaching in the classroom, because there is an overlap, of course. So what they can do is co-plan a scheme of work. So we can look at what kinds of subjects, topics or concepts the bilingual teacher needs to work on. And the language teacher can say, okay, what kinds of language do we think we might need to be using to teach those particular concepts or topics? And support that by presenting and working with the language in the language classroom, even though it's not perhaps on the curriculum. And the other way around. So the subject teachers, the bilingual teachers, can look at what kinds of things the learners are expected to do in terms of skills work in the language classroom. Are they expected to learn how to write reports or give presentations or hold a debate? Well, maybe there's some ways that we can include those things also in the bilingual classroom so that they get more practice and they see how to do it in different contexts. Okay, so there's different ways of looking at the scheme of work, the curriculum, and finding points of commonality or ways that you can support each other or give more practice to the learners in terms of certain things. Language teachers have more flexibility perhaps in the topics that they talk about. So when the language teacher is teaching, the language teacher has to teach language. Maybe the biology teacher is talking about animal classification or something. Maybe the language teacher can do something, use a text talking about the topic that they're learning about in biology in the language class to focus on the language, which is their main objective, but the topic could be linked. So we're looking for ways of linking perhaps the subjects, the concepts or the topics as well. You could also work together with teachers to co-create materials. Now, language teachers are very good at thinking of ways for learners to practice language so that it becomes automatic. The production of that language becomes automatic for them. They can look at the demands and assess the linguistic demands of a sequence of tasks for the bilingual teacher and say, okay, what we could do to help support the language here is this, this, and this. Okay, so language teachers are very good at identifying ways of making sure that the language is supported. Also, we talked before about perhaps that the language teachers can look for texts or videos or whatever that follow the same kinds of topics that the bilingual teachers are working on in the classroom. Well, why not? You know, a language teacher is not necessarily a subject specialist. If you're working with the physics teacher, and like me, your physics is a little bit rusty from when you studied it at school, maybe the physics teacher can help by explaining some of the concepts to you to help you to understand in the classroom so that you can then work with them in the language classroom with your learners and so on. Okay, so finding ways of helping and supporting. Each teacher has different strengths and can support the other teacher's weaknesses with those strengths. Another thing that is very important, I think, that we can do to collaborate is to co-assess. So in the language classroom, if you're working with a subject teacher, you can ask the subject teacher to help you to assess the tasks that you've been working on in the language classroom, and vice versa. The language teacher can be invited to give some kind of feedback on or assessment of the language use in the subject classroom too. Now, in order to do that, you might need to prepare exams together so that you have an exam that has linguistic questions on the language area you've been working on, but also content questions for the subject area and work on that together. Or you could perhaps ask the students to do written work, you know, write a report, write a paragraph or what have you, give a presentation. They could give the presentation in both classes, or if that's difficult time-wise and in terms of coordinating when each teacher can visit the other classroom, you could record things, get them to do an audio recording or record a presentation, and then both teachers can give their points of view on the assessment. Another thing that's very effective from the learner's point of view, but also from the teacher's point of view, is to pair teach. Now, obviously, this is very difficult to organise in the classroom. Teachers have busy timetables, and it can be very difficult to find moments where you're free and you can actually go and visit each other's classroom on a regular basis. But if this is something that can be organised within your school, if this is something that you can do, then it's one of the most effective ways to collaborate. So the language teacher spends some time in the classroom when the bilingual teacher is teaching, and is there as a reference for language and an extra pair of eyes. And the language teacher will then have a much better picture of what's going on and what kind of language demands the subject teacher's class has for those particular learners, and where the learners are struggling linguistically and therefore can plan things in their own class to support that, and vice versa. If the subject teacher can be in the language classroom, they can, you know, be an extra pair of eyes and an extra pair of hands. You learn a lot from watching other teachers teach, from being in the classroom when other teachers are teaching, and I would really recommend this if it's any way possible to do it in your teaching context. Then I would recommend trying to do this if you can. Whoops. So those are some of the things that we can do, both subject teachers and language teachers, to find ways to collaborate. And that's kind of the theory behind it. But of course, it's much more complicated than that, isn't it? We need to find ways to make it work. So on the next few slides, we'll talk about different ways that we can do that. So let's start with the English teachers, the language teachers. What can the language teachers do? So it's important that you know what the bilingual teacher plans to do and think about what kind of demands, linguistic demands, this places on the learners, and then orient your class so that there's some support for that within your own curriculum and your own teaching. So where you have choices, think about what kinds of things they need to do, to be able to do, and what kind of skills they need to develop, what kind of language they need to develop for the bilingual class, and incorporate that into your planning for your language class where you can. Obviously, you have to follow your own curriculum, but there is room for changing things, perhaps working on different topics from the ones that are in the textbook, or finding different materials or so on, and giving more emphasis to certain types of linguistic development because that's what they need to do in the subject class. You can teach general academic language and functions, which is called, I'm sorry, this is a spelling mistake here, EAP, English for Academic Purposes. So have a look at kind of more academic texts, see if you can find texts that you might be able to work on with your learners in the class. Now, when I say texts, I mean written text, but also oral text, so things that they can listen to or watch videos of. And perhaps the bilingual teachers can help you to find materials that might be interesting for the language classroom as well, that deal with their topics a little bit. Also, the other point here is, of course, that the bilingual subject teacher quite often is not necessarily a language specialist. I mean, they're a subject specialist, so they might need some extra support linguistically themselves, you know. So if they're not sure how to pronounce certain keywords like photosynthesis or hypothesis or whatever, you can work with them on pronunciation of important vocabulary. You can work with them on improving their own language so that when they're in the classroom, they're providing good linguistic models for their learners to help them to be able to develop the ability to talk about the topic. So if the teacher's able to talk fluently about the topic because their linguistic level is good, then the learners have that excellent model to follow. And this is something that the language teacher can support the subject teacher with. They can also have a look at the tasks and schemes of work that the bilingual teacher is planning to use and identify areas where the teacher might need to include more linguistic support and give some examples of the kinds of things that they might need to use. So, if you want them to do this here, perhaps you need to work a little bit on the verbs beforehand, or you might need to give them a glossary here with the nouns. Or why don't you do a little activity first where they play with flashcards to get to know the vocabulary, because otherwise they're not going to be able to do that. Okay, so that kind of identifying where you need extra support with language is something that language teachers are expert at, of course, and can give some very good advice to the subject teachers. And then language teachers can also source literary resources that cover themes or topics that come up in the bilingual classroom, as I said before. And that could be like quite far from anything that they might see in the language classroom. We'll look at an example of this in a little while. Okay, so sourcing resources that perhaps deal with the same topic area or in some way link to what's going on in the bilingual classroom. Okay, just to support that linguistic development. So let's have an example then. Let's look at an example of a cross-curricular project, and we'll think about the different ways that the teachers might be able to collaborate within a secondary school or within a learning institution. Now, this topic might not be appropriate for your particular situation, but you'll see once we have a topic area, the kinds of ways that we can link in different subject areas and then also language. Okay. We'll see that with the example, and then hopefully you can apply that to different kind of topics or projects that you might decide to do in your own school. So let's imagine that you've decided to do a project on creating an environmentally friendly greenhouse. So here's the kind of aim of the project, the kind of definition of the project. So learners will build a model greenhouse with adjustable temperature and humidity control to facilitate the growth of plants. Now, what we want to do first of all here is think about, okay, if this is a project that the school has decided to do, what kind of subject, which subject teachers or which subject areas do you think might be involved in developing a project like this? I'll just give you a couple of seconds to have a think. What subject teachers do you think could be involved in a project like this? So hopefully you've come up with some ideas yourself. Let's have a look at some of the things that I thought of when I was trying to predict who would collaborate on this project. And let's see if your ideas are similar to mine. Now, my ideas are suggestions. Of course, there may be ways that other subject teachers could be involved. Of course, if you've got more imagination than I have about how this could be developed, then fantastic, well done. This is just an example. So I think the most obvious one is the science teacher, right? So the science teacher could work on designing an irrigation system or conducting fair tests to explore ways to control temperature and humidity. So bringing those scientific concepts to the subject. What do we need to know about science? Well, we need to know how to conduct a fair test. We need to know how to design systems, and then also exploring how the positioning of solar panels affects the power that's supplied to the greenhouse. So all things that are relevant to the project itself, but specifically deal with things that would come up in the science classroom. So the science teacher, I think, was perhaps the most obvious one. Let's have a think about other people who could be involved. And I was thinking maybe the technology teacher could also be involved, where you ask the learners to actually make a model using wood and perspex of their greenhouse design. Or you could get them to design and build a fan, which they could use within the greenhouse to distribute the temperature evenly so that all the areas of the greenhouse have the same temperature. Or you could get them designing and building rainwater catchment devices so that they collect rainwater, which is then used to irrigate the things that are growing in the greenhouse. And then in science, they design an irrigation system that would use the rainwater that they catch in this part of the project. So the different teachers are working on different things, but they're working on things that can link together. Okay. So let's have a look at a third teacher that could then be involved. Let's think about maths. Maths, of course, can be involved in almost every subject, I think, in some way or another, but maths is a great one for this project also. The maths teacher could work on investigating how to calculate the surface area and the best shape then for the greenhouse. Okay, so once in science you've decided, you've looked at the design and conducted fair tests and so on, you've decided that a bigger surface area is better or a smaller surface area is better, then you can work on geometry and maths and actually calculate, well, if I design it this way, how big is the surface area? And if I do it this way, how big is it? And so on, you can compare. They could also calculate the amounts of materials needed and the costs of those materials. So like a very practical mathematical problem solving approach to, okay, if we're going to build, this is your design, this is your template, these are the materials that you've decided that you're going to use, you've worked on building a model in technology. Let's imagine you're going to build it now. If this is your model and it's this big, how much material? So scaling things up and then let's look at the cost. How much would that cost then? Very practical skills and very useful skills for the real world. And finally, the maths teacher could work on drawing graphs to represent temperature, humidity, and working out averages over time. So collecting and analysing data, which is also part of the maths curricula. Also links into science, of course. Science involves collecting and analysing data too. So that could overlap with both of them a little bit there, I think. So here are three fantastic ways that different bilingual subject teachers could collaborate. And I want to just point out here that perhaps you're working in a school where the technology teacher is teaching in English, but the science and maths teachers are teaching in the L1 in Spanish. That doesn't mean that they can't collaborate on the project. I think it's a very interesting proposal, actually, to have projects that are cross-curricular outside the bilingual department. So you're working on similar concepts and themes and topics and things that link in, and doing it in Spanish with this teacher, but English with that teacher. And I think that's a very interesting and important way to collaborate also. So not just looking for collaboration between the teachers that teach in English or whatever the L2 is in the school, but also looking for ways to collaborate, you know, with the whole school and make it a whole school thing, so that the Spanish teachers, so that the English teachers in the bilingual department don't feel like we're separate from the rest of the school and we're doing our own thing. It's a whole school thing. Get the teachers who are teaching in Spanish to do it in Spanish in their classes too, so that the students can see that. One of the things in the new CEFR is mediation, and mediation is all about that kind of being able to switch to and from different languages and you know, mediate the concepts for people. So if I listen to an explanation in English, can I then explain to my science teacher who teaches in Spanish, you know, what I've learned about that, translating that across and summarizing the concepts in my own language, and vice versa. If I read a text in Spanish and then I'm doing technology in English, can I then say to the technology teacher in English, you know, this is what I've understood from this text and this is what we need to do. Okay, so that kind of, don't limit it only to the bilingual schools departments in the school. If you're in a school where there's teachers teaching in Spanish too, then involve those teachers too. Why not? It's a good model for the students as well of how to collaborate, you know, internationally. And then, of course, the question that we need to ask then, if you're the English teacher, is, okay, here's this great project that the science teacher, the technology teacher and the maths teacher are all involved in. I want to be part of this too. They're all teaching in English, or some of them are. What exactly could I do then as the language teacher to participate in this project? Let's think about some of the things that the language teacher could then do. So we've got the concepts and the kind of ideas of what each of the bilingual teachers might be doing in their classrooms, or even the Spanish teachers might be doing in their classrooms. And the language teacher then needs to say, okay, well, what kind of support can I give to that? Or what kind of, how can I add to that? Or how can I help make sure that that works well? So what the language teacher would then need to do is identify the language demands and think about ways to work on those in the English lessons as well. So in science, for those kinds of ideas that we came up with on the previous slide, what kinds of linguistic challenges might those different tasks involve for the learners? Well, the learners might need to be able to describe processes, or look at a flowchart and put into words what the information is that's being shown by that flowchart is. And so they might need to be able to practice that with different topics in the English language classroom. They might need to be using conditionals to describe things. So if we adjust the speed of the fan, then the temperature will be more equal across the whole greenhouse. So you're thinking about, okay, if this is the thing that they're going to be doing in the science class, what kinds of things will they need to be able to say? What's the language of those things? They might be looking at passive voice. So the temperature is controlled by increasing or decreasing the speed of the fan, and so on. Okay, so you would look at those tasks and think about what's the language then. In technology, they might need to be able to describe or name materials, and they might need to give instructions to each other for building model, especially if they're working in groups. And for maths, they might need some maths vocabulary for describing operations, like multiply the by the to get the. So that kind of being able to talk about operations in maths. But also we talked about analysing data, so they might need to be able to use language to describe graphs and charts. Okay, so they could do some practice, and they might do some practice with different topic areas, but they're still practicing the same language functions. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're always talking about greenhouses and perspex and wood and what have you. They might talk about different things. But you could say to them, oh, look, you talked about this. Maybe that would, you know, that process would be useful. That same kind of language might be useful when you're doing your project with your maths teacher or your science teacher. Okay, so making it clear to the learners how they can reuse the language in the language classroom to help them to achieve what the subject teachers are doing in the subject classroom too. And then another way that the language teacher can be involved, and I think this is an extremely important thing, you can focus specifically on language demands and work on those particular areas of language to make sure that they have the language that they need to be able to do what the subject teachers want them to do in the classroom. But you can also work on the topic and work a little bit outside the topic and broaden the topic a little bit, and perhaps find some literature that will help just what's the word, increasing their kind of general knowledge on the topic of the usefulness of a project like this. And so when I was thinking about this particular project, the greenhouse project, one of the books that came to mind that you could work on in the English classroom is one called The City of Ember, which is a post-apocalyptic novel. This is from Wikipedia, copy and pasted, but just so that you can see the topic and how it links in. It's a novel by Jean Duprel that was published in 2003, and it's about a city underground threatened because it has an aging infrastructure and corruption. And so they have to follow clues left behind by the original builders of the city to safety in the outside world. So this kind of talking about technology and so on comes up a lot in the book, and there's lots of texts that are kind of relevant to what they might be doing, you know, this kind of creation of a self-sufficient greenhouse. You could talk about, well, could the protagonists of the story create a self-sufficient greenhouse once they get into the outside world to help them survive, and so on. Okay, so things that kind of link in. The links can be very vague. It doesn't have to be a very direct link, but something that thematically links with what they're doing in the project as well. And I just want to finish this webinar today with something that I came across when I read quite a lot of, blogs and educational blogs and so on. And this, I've put the link down here for it, eltplanning.com. This is a language teacher who has started working as at pair teaching, in fact, working in the classroom with a science teacher. And he's been blogging about his experience of that. And I thought it was a very interesting article to read if this is something that you want to get into and something that you would like to do. So you can, copy the link and read the full article if this is something that you're interested in, especially if you're a language teacher, but also from the point of view of bilingual subject teachers, thinking about, well, what kinds of things could language teachers do to help me? What kinds of things could I ask them to do? And I just want to share this quote about his experience of that. So he says it's co-teaching or team teaching. The subject teacher does the main input. We cover key vocabulary together on first input. We work to clarify concepts. Sorry, I can't actually see this. During either an input phase or during a task. Okay, so they're both working to try and clarify the concepts. They're both working on making sure the learners understand the vocabulary at input. I help learners access the content and raise awareness to both the subject teacher and learners. So the language teacher there is supporting the subject teacher too with language, of process language needs and gaps. Okay, there's a lot of collaboration between all parties. Translanguaging on occasions too, as you might expect. Now, just in case you're not sure what translanguaging means, that's when you switch backwards and forwards between languages within the same sentence. Okay, so you might say, how can we explicar this? That would be translanguaging. Okay, so using words and expressions from both languages to communicate, where you're in a situation where all the people present have both of the languages to a greater or lesser degree, and it's used as a support mechanism, certainly in bilingual classes. Something that we would perhaps try to avoid as a language teacher is a very useful tool in the subject classroom, okay, and helps us to get the learners to understand the concepts which are the main focus of the class. So there's a little explanation. Translanguaging is the process whereby speakers use their languages as an integrated communication system. So any languages that you have access to that you know that your audience will understand, you can switch backwards and forwards. It's the focus is communication. So you're using different languages to try and communicate as efficiently and effectively as you can. It continues. There's some active language upgrading or upskilling between teachers and learners. Okay, so the teachers and the learners are helping, the teachers are helping the learners to upgrade or upskill their language as the class happens. Between the learners together a bit, so the learners actually support each other there too, because they have a very good model in the fact that the teachers are doing this between themselves too. So they copy that. You know, if a learner can't say something, the other learners feel like they can help too. And teacher to teacher in the moment too. So it's not just we're the teachers, we know everything, you're the learners, you're learning, but also the teachers are supporting each other. One teacher is a language expert, the other teacher is a subject expert. And the language teacher will say, well, I don't really understand this concept. Can you explain it to me a little bit again so I can help the learners with it? And the subject teacher will say, I'm not really sure how to say this in English. Can you help me to say it in English so that I can explain it properly to the learners? So in front of the learners, as a very good model of learners themselves, the teachers are modeling and demonstrating how they support each other as different specialists. So some content questions will inevitably come up that I can't answer as a language teacher. In that case, we get input from the subject teacher who teaches all of us. I process what's been said, perhaps think on the spot how I might need to grade the explanation. Then we might go back into groups with some learners for a bit of clarification. Okay, so they're kind of not over planning it particularly, but reacting to the situation at the time, learning from each other, and as a result, helping the learners to learn from both teachers at the same time. I felt that was a very clear and excellent explanation of how collaboration actually works, you know, within the classroom. If you can get to the situation where you have the ability to actually be in the classroom with each other at the same time, it's a very powerful way to collaborate between teachers. So I'm assuming that that there won't be any questions. So I'm going to say, if you do have any questions, do feel free to write to me or to whatever, to find me on social media, and I will try and answer your questions for you. But without further ado, I'm actually going to say thank you very much for listening, and I hope that the explanations of how to collaborate and the example of how that might look within the project and the article that I've shared the link with at the end there are useful and will help to motivate you to actually make those links with other teachers in the school. Thank you very much.